Mr. Pryor, no. Mr. Rockefeller, no. Mr. Corker, aye. Mr. Harkin, no. Mr. Begich, no. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Anyone wishing to vote or change their vote?
Any senators wishing to vote or change their votes?
Hold on one second.
Oh,
Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Feinstein, no.
any senators wishing to vote or to change their votes? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 46, the nays are 54. The motion is not agreed to. Senator from Arkansas.
Madam Chair, I yield 1 hour of my time post-cloture to Senator Sessions.
Senator has that right.
Madam President.
Senator from Washington.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to a period of morning business with Senator. Madam President, the Senate's not in order.
Senate will be in order.
Madam President, I ask.
1 minute. Senate will be in order. Senate will be in order. Senator from Washington.
Thank you, Madam President. I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to a period of morning business with senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each, with the exception of Senator Grassley for up to 20 minutes, further that the time count post-cloture.
Is there objection? Without objection. York.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to the immediate consideration of H.R. 3588, which is at the desk.
Clerk will report.
H.R. 3588, an act to amend the Safe Drinking Water Act to exempt fire hydrants from the prohibition on the use of lead pipes, fittings, fixtures, solder, and
Nothing
flux.
wrong with my saying something for a minute.
Is there objection to proceeding to the motion? Without objection, the Senate will proceed.
I further ask that the bill be read 3 times and passed, and the motion to reconsider be made and laid upon the table with no intervening action or debate.
Without objection.
Madam President,
Senator from New York.
just to go over what happened here. This is on behalf of myself and Senator Toomey. It's a bipartisan bill. There was a recently released Environmental Protection Agency interpretation of a law that could cost local governments, municipalities, and taxpayers millions of dollars across the country and undermine public safety. It's a classic case of the federal bureaucracy and restriction harming local communities and our budgets. And you wouldn't believe this, but it's about one of the most basic functions of government, fire hydrants. Almost 3 years ago, Congress passed the Reduction of Lead in Drinking Water Act. That's a legislation with an admirable goal, a goal spelled out right in the name, and the law is set to be implemented on January 4th, 2014. As you know, Congress intended for this law to direct the EPA to make rules that would keep our drinking water safe from coming into contact with lead-based parts. So, Congress did that and exempted, and EPA exempted parts in bathtubs and showers that don't have direct impact on the quality of drinking water, like the knobs, the hot and cold knobs, while of course the faucets would be under the law. But at the end of October, suddenly the EPA released a new interpretation of the law that for the first time put fire hydrants under the new standards set by law, meaning everyone needs to buy and install new and upgraded fire hydrants that contain less lead. It took everyone by surprise. Only a small fraction of fire hydrants are ever used for drinking water. And even when they are, lead poisoning is associated with long-term exposure, which doesn't occur on occasions that someone might drink from a hydrant. And while that surprising rule was announced at the end of October, the EPA is expecting all new fire hydrants installed after January 4th to be of this new reduced lead standard. No manufacturer can make fire hydrants that quickly. And if this interpretation stands, cities and county water authorities would be forced to throw out hundreds of hydrants now in stock, wasting millions of dollars, and passing that waste on to consumers in terms of rate hike. And at the same time, there'd be no new hydrants they could install when a fire hydrant malfunctioned, when it was run over by a car in an accident, when a snowplow knocked it down. So we're glad that this legislation that we have just passed, and I'm with my colleague and I from Pennsylvania, are glad that we will now exempt fire hydrants from the reduced lead standard, just as bathtub and shower pieces that don't have contact with the water are exempt. Simply put, the EPA's interpretation of reduced lead standards unnecessarily imposed a huge burden on municipalities and first responders without any discernible safety benefit. We have now undone that danger. I yield the floor.
Gentleman yield.
Be happy to yield to my colleague from Ohio.
I just want to thank the gentleman and our colleague from Pennsylvania, Mr. Toomey, for their work on this issue. Municipalities all around the country, including my state of Ohio, were shocked to hear about this, and I appreciate joining my colleague from New York on a letter to the EPA. And cash-strapped cities in New York, Ohio, other states are happy to know they're not going to have to take on this burden. It makes sense to stop, take a look at this, be sure that we're not forcing these hydrants that otherwise are in good shape to be repaired and replaced. It's not something that's in these budgets that these cities have, and so I appreciate the gentleman's work on it and look forward to ensuring that this does not move forward as a regulation, but also that we figure out a more sensible way to deal with the issue.
I thank my colleague from Ohio and appreciate his good work on this. We have now saved municipalities millions of dollars, as well as ensured safety in our communities, because the fire hydrants that are in stock will be able to be used. I yield the floor, Madam President.
Madam President,
Senator from Alabama.
on the last vote, I just want to mention to my colleagues what happened and what has happened. A major bill dealing with the debt of the United States was supposed to come out of budget conference committee and come here. The budget conference committee failed to complete its meetings, and a piece of legislation was sent to the Senate. That legislation has not been subject to amendment. The majority leader decided there would be no amendments, and he would simply tell us that if you have amendments that will kill the bill, or if you have amendments that will make us delay, and we can't do it and we won't do it, and you don't get an amendment. A number of good amendments have been filed. The one that we just voted on was one of the most egregious. That amendment reduces the retirement pay of United States military without reducing the retirement pay of anyone else that served in government, just the military. So I filed and I moved to table the filled tree that Majority Leader Reid has been using to block anybody from having amendments in the United States Senate on serious legislation. I mean, this is serious legislation. We didn't get the vote on it. And so the choice for our colleagues when they cast their vote, would they vote to allow an amendment to be voted on that would protect veteran military retirees from having their pensions reduced? Or would you support the majority leader in his determination to block any amendments to the legislation? And so a majority has voted. They voted to block the classical rights of United States senators to have amendments and to protect the leadership and the domination, really, of this Senate in an unprecedented way by the majority leader. He's already filled the tree more times than the previous four majority leaders combined, more than twice as often. Every bill now, it seems, he fills the tree, and to get an amendment, he has to approve it, or you don't get it, or if he decides there are no amendments, there are no amendments. So this is contrary to the tradition of the Senate. We've got to change this, and this highlights the danger of supporting that kind of process, because it keeps us from fixing bad legislation and improving it. I would thank the chair and would yield the floor.
Senator from Iowa.
Soon we'll be voting on the nomination of Mr. Mayorkas for Deputy of Secretary, Department of Homeland Security. I have concerns about the nomination. First, I'll discuss how Mr. Mayorkas has carried out the President's directive giving legal status to thousands of individuals who are in the United States unlawfully. In 2012, Mr. Mayorkas was charged with implementing this President's directive known as DACA, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. I have always questioned whether the President's directive is legal. The administration never responded to our request for their legal basis or opinions. This administration has not been transparent about who is getting deferred action, how they are processing them, and whether those who have been denied have been processed for removal. They may call this program Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, but it clearly benefits older adults and possibly people who intentionally broke our laws. The agency didn't deny any single applicant until after the 2012 election. We still don't know how many people were actually denied. We do know, however, that people were approved despite shoddy evidence, such as an Xbox receipt and a Facebook posting. They always seem to find a way to get approval. And all denials for DACA have to be run through Washington. Adjudicators on the line were giving clear instruction that they were not allowed to deny any applicant. Now, whistleblowers tell me, they said that Mr. Mayorkas himself had to approve all denials. Now, think about that. No denials were allowed unless the head of the agency personally approved the denial. What kind of message does that send to civil servants, the career employees, trying to do their job under the law, as the law requires, to be very impartial? The boss has his thumb on the scales. That isn't the rule of law. Mr. Mayorkas' message to adjudicators seems to have been that they had better get to yes, or he'd personally get involved. This get to yes philosophy came up time and again with agency whistleblowers. The Office of Inspector General looked into the situation, and the Inspector General confirmed what employers had said. A quarter of Immigration Service officers interviewed felt pressure to approve questionable applicants. 90% felt that they didn't have sufficient time to complete interviews of those who seek benefits. The Office of Inspector General report clearly showed that the agency had been pervaded by this get-to-yes culture. Unfortunately, that culture hadn't changed under Mr. Mayorkas' leadership. In fact, based on concerns that I heard from whistleblowers who contacted my offices in mid-July this year, it seems to have even gotten worse. These whistleblowers were aware that Mr. Mayorkas had been nominated to this Homeland Security position by late June. They were also aware that since the fall of 2012, Mr. Mayorkas had been a subject of an Office of Inspector General investigation into allegations of ethical or criminal misconduct. When Mr. Mayorkas' nomination hearing was scheduled, the whistleblowers were very surprised. They wondered why a hearing would proceed while the investigation was still open and pending, and contacted then my office to make sure Congress was told about the investigation. The existence of this investigation was news to me at that time. However, I didn't sit on the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, so my staff contacted the staff, a ranking member of that committee, Dr. Coburn. His staff was also unaware that the nominee was under investigation by the Inspector General. It is extremely troubling, then, that a hearing was scheduled to proceed without the ranking member of the committee knowing about the pending investigation of the nominee within the executive branch. Both my staff and ranking member Coburn's staff contacted the Inspector General's office. We told his office about the whistleblower allegations and asked for confirmation as to whether there was an open inquiry. This type of procedural information is routinely disclosed by an Inspector General's office to Congress, and rightly so. Further, we asked for an explanation of why that information would be withheld while the committee was considering the nomination. Now, you understand that the Senate has a constitutional function of providing advice and consent on these nominations. In order to do our duty, every senator who is asked to vote on that nominee needs to have all the relevant information about that nominee, and particularly when there's a pending investigation. To its credit, the Office of Inspector General answered our questions and confirmed there was indeed an open criminal investigation. Their written description stated that the inquiry involves, quote, alleged conflicts of interest, misuse of position, mismanagement of EB-5 program, and the appearance of impropriety by Mayorkas and other management officials, end quote. How was it possible, then, that this information was withheld from staff for the ranking member of the committee considering that nomination? If not for the whistleblowers that came forward, would we have known this fact of the nomination, of the investigation? When a nominee is under investigation, the Senate has no business approving that nominee until the facts are in. Historically, committees have followed this precedent. As Ranking Member Coburn explained last week, both the President and the Vice President supported this precedent when they were here in the United States Senate. In July 2005, one ambassadorial nominee owned a company under investigation. Then Senator Biden spoke out in support of delaying the vote on that nomination because of the investigations. Eventually, the nominee's company agreed to settle the investigation against it. Then Senator Obama's spokesman issued a statement saying that due to the fact that a settlement was reached, Senator Obama would not seek to block the nomination. Like then Senators Obama and Biden, I believe the Senate should wait for investigations to conclude. Or if the executive branch is taking too long, then Congress should do its own fact-finding. But forcing senators to vote in ignorance is not a legitimate option. In fact, it's irresponsible. Voting to approve a nominee who is under investigation without waiting for the facts is incredibly risky. What if the investigation determines allegations are true? Then, by rushing to approve the nominee, this body would have failed one of our key functions under the Constitution. I pointed this out when the Senate was considering the nomination of B. Todd Jones to become permanent head of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. Mr. Jones was the subject of an Office of Special Counsel investigation due to allegations that he retaliated against a whistleblower in the U.S. Attorney's Office in Minnesota. As Mr. Jones's nomination progressed in the Senate, the Justice Department and the whistleblower agreed to try mediation. The majority tried to claim that the special counsel's case was therefore closed. However, I did state on the floor the special counsel's investigation would continue if mediation failed. Nevertheless, despite the open special counsel investigation, we voted on July 31st to confirm Mr. Jones. In early September, the whistleblower's mediation with the Justice Department did indeed fail. The special counsel has resumed its investigations of Mr. Jones, just as the special counsel had told the Senate that it would. So the retaliation complaint against Mr. Jones is still pending this very day. We don't know what the outcome will be because we did not take time to gather the facts as senators should. If we're unwilling to wait for an executive branch inquiry, then we should further gather the facts ourselves. Last week, Ranking Member Coburn asked Chairman Levin of the Permanent Subcommittee on Investigations whether that committee would consider interviewing witnesses in controversy involving Mr. Mayorkas. While he declined, Chairman Levin rightly noted that if the subcommittee were going to launch such an investigation, the vote on Mr. Mayorkas would need to be delayed. I completely agree. This vote should not take place until someone has been able to gather testimony and draw conclusions about these allegations. Whistleblowers have provided my office with very troubling evidence regarding the substance of some of the allegations. Much of the evidence involves the EB-5 Regional Center Program, which Mr. Mayorkas is responsible for managing. The evidence appears to support allegations Mr. Mayorkas and his leadership team at Citizenship and Immigration Services are susceptible to political pressure and favoritism. Our immigration system should be governed by equal application of the law, not by who has the best political connections to the director of the agency. I have given Mr. Mayorkas a chance to defend himself and explain the evidence, which seems compelling. Back in July and August, I wrote several letters to Mr. Mayorkas outlining whistleblower allegations and attaching some of the documents that the whistleblowers provided. I asked how he accounted for this evidence, but he has utterly failed to reply to my letters. It's been 4 or 5 months since I sent Mr. Mayorkas these letters. Just like his personal oversight of DACA, these documents show Mr. Mayorkas being much more directly involved in individual EB-5 cases than he has led my staff or Homeland Security Committee to believe. They appear to show him intervening in EB-5 decisions involving Gulf Coast Funds Management, an organization run by nobody other than Hillary Clinton's brother, Anthony Rodham. This decision benefited Green Tech Automotive, a company run by Terry McAuliffe that was receiving funding from Gulf Coast Funds Management. This evidence about political influence and intervention is particularly troubling because Mr. Mayorkas' prior history. In 2001, Mr. Mayorkas had a role in a group of pardons and commutations issued by President Clinton in the closing days of the second term. In 2002, House report found that then U.S. Attorney Mayorkas inappropriately sought to influence a decision regarding whether drug trafficker Carlos Vinali prison sentence should be commuted. However, my concerns about the investigation pending against Mr. Mayorkas are about more than just improper political influence. Under his leadership over the last few years, the EB-5 program has grown far beyond its original intent, which I supported. It is intended to be an avenue for foreign investors to participate in new commercial enterprises that actually create jobs in this country in exchange for a U.S. visa. The program was created as a pilot, allowing regional centers to pool funds from investors to create new businesses and to create jobs. In the process, the centers had to prove they were creating those jobs that they promised to create. Skeptics question if the program truly creates jobs. Whistleblowers have expressed concern that foreign investors are not being vetted carefully enough. They say Mr. Mayorkas is more interested in approving applications quickly than making security checks more robust. Given what we know about these security concerns inside the agency, Congress needs to re-examine this program. It should serve its purpose without compromising national security. Mr. Mayorkas claims that he has changed the program since learning of fraud and security concerns. The only tangible change that we have seen is that additional economists have been hired and adjudicators from California, were moved here to Washington, D.C. Yet moving the EB-5 process to Washington increased Mr. Mayorkas' control over the program, just as he has in the DACA program. Whistleblowers have provided me with emails from Mr. Mayorkas saying that he wants to keep fraud and national security concerns about Green Tech or the SLS Hotel in Las Vegas, quote, unquote, close hold. As I said earlier, the rule of law isn't possible when the boss has his thumbs on the scales. Further, the regional center programs has serious national security risks that the director hasn't addressed. He convened a working group with national security advisors, but no formal product was finalized. The interagency collaborations seem to fizzle. Whistleblowers say the working group was mere window dressing. In the agency, employees received EB-5 applications from individuals with derogatory information about them in classified government files. But they were given little or no guidance about how to make sure that such were denied. Instead, they were pressured to approve applications as quickly as possible. Simply put, the integrity of our immigration system is in question as long as the program continues without needed reforms, which could be done this very day. On the May 15, 2012, Chairman Leahy and I wrote to Mr. Mayorkas regarding the program and expressed our concerns about the potential for abuse of the program. We asked for his commitment to administratively reform two aspects of the program. He responded that he was interested in the reforms. Yet, it has been these long 19 months, and he has taken no action. Mr. Mayorkas says he's concerned with fraud and abuse in the program. But actions speak louder than words. Despite my recent letters with questions about fraud and security concerns, not to mention political influence, Mr. Mayorkas is either completely unwilling or unable to respond to the allegations. I sat down with Chairman Carper on August 1, and he agreed that I deserved answers to my questions from the nominee. And now he has pressed forward without getting answers. I'm truly surprised that this majority is not interested in getting to the bottom of these allegations. In other words, something that's under investigation, the same way that a Senator Biden and a Senator Obama demanded that we do during a previous presidency. If this body is unwilling to wait to the end of an investigation, or if we aren't willing to conduct our own inquiry, one day this whole nomination will come back to bite us. As I said with B. Todd Jones when he was confirmed, eventually one of these situations will embarrass the Senate and damage the reputation of the federal government. If this majority is determined to ignore ongoing investigations and at the same time ram through nominees, the American people should hold the Senate accountable for not doing its constitutional job. In fact, refusing to do its constitutional job. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Connecticut.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I'm coming down to the floor today for just a few minutes. I know our senator from Ohio is seeking recognition as well, just to mark, as I have most weeks, a new number, and that number is 11,584, the number of gun deaths that America has experienced over the last year since December 14th of last year. That date is burned in the memories of those of us in Connecticut and across the nation because that was the date that 26 people, 20 little 6- and 7-year-olds and 6 teachers and educators that were there to protect them died in Sandy Hook, and we recognize the one-year anniversary. Anniversary sounds like an awful word, the one-year mark of that shooting this weekend. And since then, almost 12,000 people have died at the hands of guns since then. And I've tried to come down to the floor of the Senate in the months since to remind folks that these victims have stories, to give voice to these victims. And I just want to share a few more today. We were all gripped just a few days ago by news of another school shooting, not too far from Columbine. Arapahoe saw another young man, very troubled, walk in with a shotgun and essentially open fire, apparently because of a grievance that he had with his debate coach. Caught in the crossfire was a 17-year-old girl, Claire Davis. Claire was described as outgoing, athletic, an excellent student. According to reports, she loved horses, and she'd recently placed second in an equestrian competition. Another student said that Claire is one of the nicest people I've ever met at Arapahoe High School. Claire survived, but she's still in a coma today, 17 years old, just because she was in the wrong place at her high school, a place where everyone expects you are able to go to school in safety. She isn't on this number yet because she survived, but her life is changed forever because of yet another school shooting, school shootings that now seem to pop up on the news on a weekly basis. But it's not just these school shootings where mass violence takes place. Now you can pick up most local papers and every month see evidence of a new mass shooting. In Manchester, Connecticut, on December 7th of this year, 40-year-old John Lynn shot Brittany Mills, 28, Kamisha Mills, 23, and Atara Benson, 46, before killing himself in a quadruple murder. He had a history of domestic violence. Police haven't completely sorted out exactly what happened, but all four of them are dead, marking the 8th homicide stemming from intimate partner violence in Connecticut since January 1st, 2013. Just days before, in Alma, Arkansas, Tim Adams, who's believed to be in his early 50s, before killing himself, killed his 4-month-old grandson, his 4-year-old granddaughter, and the 30-year-old boyfriend of his daughter, Michael Williams, in the midst of what seemed to be a pretty simple argument about his daughter's court date, which exploded into an episode of mass violence which took the lives of a 4-month-old, a 4-year-old, a 31-year-old, and then, as many of these episodes do, the life of the shooter himself. And so these episodes of mass shootings are not just about what happens in schools or movie theaters or places of worship. They're happening in backyards in Alma, Arkansas. They're happening in apartment complexes in Manchester, Connecticut. And this body, in the 360-some-odd days since December 14th, has done absolutely nothing about it. And the survivors of these incidents of violence are the story that we don't talk enough about. I've come down here to tell you the story today of Claire Davis and Brittany Mills and Kamisha Mills and Atara Benson and Tim Adams and Chase Don Williams and Kiera Adams and Michael Williams. They all died by gunshots. But they left behind children and parents and neighbors who are scarred for life. Psychologists will tell you that when a shooting occurs, there are at least 10 people who experience life-altering trauma. And what we know is that episodes of trauma just don't affect you up here, they affect your entire body. We have new developing evidence that show that children that are that experience multiple episodes of trauma in their life, and they frankly don't have to be as grave or as serious as a shooting, are physiologically affected for the rest of their life. People who witness trauma and experience trauma die earlier than people who don't. Never mind have episodes related to post-traumatic stress that stay with them for the rest of their lives. And so the spillover, the ripple effects of these 11,000 deaths, frankly, represent a number that can't even fit on a chart like this. And there's no simple solution, Madam President. I know that sometimes it seems like the only thing we come down here and talk about are stricter gun laws, and I just don't believe there's any reason why we don't require criminal background checks for guns before they're purchased, or that we don't just simply say that these dangerous assault weapons should stay out of the hands of people who aren't in law enforcement or the military. But that's not the beginning and end of the conversation. This young man who walked into Arapahoe High School, Carl Pearson, started shooting the place up because he was upset about his place on the debate team. Now, he apparently had had a history of discipline incidents at that school, but he clearly had some serious issues and mental illness inside him that was not being identified and treated. And of course, the same thing can be said of Jared Lee Loughner and Adam Lanza, and now the long list of mass shooters across this country. We absolutely have to put more resources into our mental health system. And I appreciate my colleagues on the other side of the aisle who have said, yeah, we're not willing to go with you when it comes to background checks or assault weapons, but we'll work with you on mental health funding. Well, in order to do that, you actually have to put the money behind the system. We've closed down 4,000 inpatient mental health beds in this country over the last 5 years. Why? Because the federal government is pulling funding from the very programs that actually support increased mental health resources that can identify these individuals before they perpetrate incidents of mass violence. So there is an illusion of bipartisan support around the issue of mental health, even while we have these outstanding disagreements on gun laws, and yet there really isn't agreement, because when you're fighting over the budget, when Republicans are calling for massive cuts to programs like Medicaid or the Mental Health Block Grant, then they're undermining the very programs that actually help identify people and help people like Carl Pearson or like Adam Lanza. And so enough is enough. I'll be down here after the holiday, and that number will now be over 12,000. 12,000 individuals, many of them little girls and boys like those represented on this chart, like Daniel Barden and Jesse Lewis and Dylan Hockley. And back in Newtown, out of respect for the families who are just tired from 365 days of grieving, there was no big public remembrance on Saturday. There was a small private ceremony that I had the honor of attending at St. Rose Church, where so many of the children were parishioners. And as tired as that community is, they also were bewildered in Newtown, because they went up to the state capitol in Connecticut and got laws passed that will prevent these kind of episodes of mass violence in the future. But they came down to Washington, and while they got a lot of meetings, they got absolutely no progress. Zilch, zip, nada. And as we head into 2013, Madam President, I hope that the memory of these little boys and girls won't fade as we get beyond the one-year mark of Sandy Hook. And my hope is that people will start paying attention to this number, creeping up to 12,000 deaths. And will recognize that while this number simply represents the number of people who have died, there are all sorts of people out there like Claire Davis who survived, but survived gun incidents with injuries that will cripple them for the rest of their lives. And there are, frankly, hundreds of thousands of more people who surround these incidents of violence, who have their lives changed forever because of the trauma they experience. All of these victims, whether they were killed in the incident or were part of the collateral damage, they have voices, voices that should command this place sometime soon to action. I yield back the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Rhode Island.
Madam President, may I ask consent to speak as if in morning business for up to 20 minutes?
Without objection.
Thank you very much, Madam President. This is my 53rd time for consecutive weeks that we're in session that I've come to the floor to speak about climate change and to urge my colleagues that it is time to wake up. These speeches aren't easy, and a great deal of effort goes into assisting me with research and crafting of them, and I am particularly grateful for the hard work of Dr. Todd Bianco in helping me to prepare them. He's the fellow sitting on the other side of the sign looking embarrassed that I've just called him out. Todd joined my office in September 2012 as a Geological Society of America U.S. Geological Survey Congressional Science Fellow, and he has contributed considerable scientific understanding and analytical rigor to our work. His ability to interpret the latest climate research has helped me to convey complex scientific concepts both accurately and in a way that is accessible and meaningful to policymakers and the public. You may be used to seeing him with me here on the floor for each week's speech, but he's also been effective in researching legislation and preparing for hearings in the Environment and Public Works Committee. I say this because this week marks the end of Todd's fellowship, and he will soon return home to Rhode Island with his wife, Allison. Allison Bianco, by the way, is a very talented artist whose work reflects our deep human connection to the natural world. So, in addition to lending us Todd, Allison has also lent us some of her artwork, which is hung on display in my front office. So in addition to thanking Todd for his efforts, I also want to thank Allison. Todd, like me, is an overmarried human being. I wish them both the best of luck back home, and I thank Todd for his work in the United States Senate to advance responsible public policy grounded firmly in the best science. And, Madam President, it is time at last for Congress to heed that best science and act responsibly. It is time to wake up. Denying and delaying is irresponsible. In the judgment of history, it will ultimately, I believe, be shameful. Carbon pollution from the burning of fossil fuels is altering the climate. The consensus around this fact within the scientific community is overwhelming. And public awareness of this crisis is growing stronger. And interestingly, it's growing stronger across party lines. Republicans might want to listen to this. A survey conducted for the League of Conservation Voters found that more than half of young Republican voters, 53% of Republicans under the age of 35, 53% would describe a politician who denies climate change is happening as, and I quote, ignorant, out of touch, or crazy. 53% of Republicans under 35 view that kind of climate denial as ignorant, out of touch, or crazy. Well, even though a majority of young Republicans understand that denying climate change is out of touch with reality, Republicans in Congress refuse to get serious. Why? Well, another national survey, this one by the Pew Research Center, found that most, 61% of non-Tea Party Republicans actually agree there is solid evidence the Earth is warming, with a plurality saying it is mostly because of humans. But the Tea Partiers are different. 70% of Tea Partiers, contrarily, say there is, quote, no solid evidence the Earth is warming. And 41% of Tea Partiers assert that warming is just not happening. Not that we don't have enough information yet, but it's just not happening. Just not regardless of what you think the cause of this is, There are legion, independent measurements that the Earth is warming. This isn't a theory. We measure that the temperature of the atmosphere and oceans is rising. We measure that snow, ice caps, and glaciers are melting. We measure that seas are rising. We measure that the very seasons are shifting. I mean, it's one thing to be the party that's against science. The Tea Partiers would make it the party against measurement. Just as the Tea Partiers led the Republicans off the government shutdown cliff, just as the Tea Partiers tried to defeat the budget deal most Republicans supported, so the Tea Party wants to lead the Republican Party off the climate cliff. Outside these walls, it is different. Responsible Republican voices more and more acknowledge the threat of climate change and call for responsible solutions. Many want to correct the market failure that aids and abets the polluters' irresponsible practices. My colleagues, Representative Henry Waxman, Representative Earl Blumenauer, Senator Brian Schatz, and I have put forward just such a market-based proposal, a revenue-neutral fee on carbon emissions, the revenues of which would be returned back to the American people. Here within Congress, where the polluters' money flows so abundantly, no Republican colleague has come forward to join us. But outside of Congress, here are some of the responsible voices in the Republican Party. Former South Carolina Representative Bob Inglis has long urged his party to get serious on climate change. In an article in the Duke Environmental Law and Policy Forum this year, Mr. Inglis invoked the tenets of conservative economics. He wrote, "If you're a conservative, it is time to step forward and engage in the climate and energy debate because we have the answer: free enterprise. Conservatives understand that we must set the correct incentives, and this should include internalizing pollution and other environmental costs in our market system. We tax income, but we don't tax emissions. It makes sense to conservatives to take the tax off something you want more of, income, and shift the tax to something you want less of, emissions." That was Bob Inglis. And that's exactly how you, to use his words, internalize pollution and other environmental costs in our market system. You do it with a carbon fee. Sherwood Boehlert and Wayne Gilchrist, former Republican representatives from New York and Virginia, in a joint February 2012 Washington Post op-ed with Representative Waxman and Senator Markey, made the fiscal case for a carbon fee. Here's what they said. "The debate over how to reduce our nation's debt has been presented as a dilemma between cutting spending on programs Americans cherish or raising taxes on American job creators. But there is a better way. We could slash our debt by making power plants and oil refineries pay for the carbon emissions that endanger our health and environment. This policy would strengthen our economy, lessen our dependence on foreign oil, keep our skies clean, and raise a lot of revenue. The best approach," they continue, "would be to use a market mechanism, such as the sale of carbon allowances or a fee on carbon pollution, to lower emissions and increase revenue." For one former Republican member of this body, the threat of climate change has serious professional implications. As Secretary of Defense, it's Chuck Hagel's job to account for all hazards to our national security and our interests in the world. He gave this clear-eyed assessment at the Halifax International Security Forum just last month. Here's what he wrote. "Climate change does not directly cause conflict but it can significantly add to the challenges of global instability, hunger, poverty, and conflict. Food and water shortages, pandemic disease, disputes over refugees and resources, more severe natural disasters, all place additional burdens on economies, societies, and institutions around the world. The effects of climate change and new energy resources are far-reaching and unpredictable, demanding our attention and strategic thinking. Top advisors to former Republican presidents have joined this chorus of Republicans speaking out on climate and urging a carbon fee. Republican presidents listened to these men and women. Who knows? Maybe Republican members of Congress will listen to them also. William D. Ruckelshaus, Lee M. Thomas, William K. Riley, and Christine Todd Whitman all headed the Environmental Protection Agency during Republican administrations. They spoke with one voice in an August New York Times op-ed. They wrote, "As administrators of the EPA under Presidents Richard M. Nixon, Ronald Reagan, George Bush, and George W. Bush, we held fast to common-sense conservative principles, protecting the health of the American people, working with the best technology available, and trusting in the innovation of American business and in the market to find the best solutions for the least cost." These former Republican officials recognize both the wisdom of properly pricing carbon and as well the obstinate opposition that stands in the way of progress in Congress. They continued in their article, I quote, "A market-based approach like a carbon tax would be the best path to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. But that is unachievable in the current political gridlock in Washington. But we must continue efforts to reduce the climate-altering pollutants that threaten our planet. The only uncertainty," they say, "the only uncertainty about how our warming world, the only uncertainty about our warming world is how bad the changes will get and how soon. What is most clear is that there is no time to waste." They could even have said that it's time to wake up. George Shultz, another prominent Republican, served as Secretary of both Labor and Treasury under President Nixon and Secretary of State under President Reagan. He, too, is calling for an end to the polluter's free ride. In an April op-ed with Nobel economist Gary Becker that appeared in Real Clear Politics, George Shultz appealed to our American sense of fairness, writing, "Americans like to compete on a level playing field. All the players should have an equal opportunity to win based on their competitive merits, not on some artificial imbalance that gives someone or some group a special advantage. We think this idea should be applied to energy producers. They all should bear the full costs of the use of the energy they provide." Let me repeat that. They all should bear the full cost of the use of the energy they provide. Clearly, Shultz continued, a revenue-neutral carbon tax would benefit all Americans by eliminating the need for costly energy subsidies while promoting a level playing field for energy producers. Veterans of a much more recent Republican administration are likewise acknowledging the appeal of a carbon fee proposal. David Frum, speechwriter to George W. Bush, wrote in a December 2012 CNN.com op-ed that a carbon fee could help address a number of pressing national issues. Here's what he wrote. Take three worrying long-term challenges: climate change, the weak economic recovery, and America's chronic budget deficits. Combine them into one, and suddenly three tough problems become one attractive solution: tax carbon. The revenues from a carbon tax could be used to reduce the deficit, while also extending new forms of payroll tax relief to middle-class families, thus supporting middle-class family incomes. Gregory Mankiw, economic advisor to George W. Bush and Mitt Romney, specifically highlighted our carbon fee proposal in an August op-ed in the New York Times. Our bill, he wrote, is more effective and less invasive than the regulatory approach that the federal government has traditionally pursued. Speaking of us, he said, if the Democratic sponsors conceded to using the new revenue to reduce personal and corporate income tax rates, a bipartisan compromise is possible to imagine. Among economists, he concluded, the issue is largely a no-brainer. Well, I say to Mr. Mankiw, as one of the Democratic sponsors, we are very interested in a bipartisan compromise. We just need a Republican to come to the negotiating table, and we can begin. That is what the American people want. It's what voters want, and it's what responsible state and local leaders want as well. Take, for example, Jim Brainard, a 5-term Republican mayor of Carmel, Indiana. In an Indianapolis Star op-ed this month, Mayor Brainard implored Democrats and Republicans alike to face up to the reality of climate change. Here's what Mayor Brainard said. This issue isn't just about saving polar bears, it's about saving our cities. No matter your politics, there is overwhelming evidence of climate change. And we, as a nation, have a moral obligation to address these issues. A moral obligation to address these issues. For himself, he says he plans to urge the federal government to take a stronger leadership role in helping our cities prepare for what is certainly coming our way. Madam President, there are a lot of Republicans out there who are awake to the threat of climate change and to the win-win benefits of pricing carbon and using the revenues to invest in tax reductions and adaptation and other ways to protect ourselves and advance our economy. Unfortunately, here in Congress, the dark, heavy hand of the polluters is helping the Tea Party drive the Republican Party off the cliff. One day, the Republican Party will pay a heavy price for this, and that day may be soon. They need to make the change. It is the responsibility of Congress to heed the warnings of environmental calamity, to stamp out market distortions that favor polluters, and to steer this country on a prudent, reasonable path toward a proud future that is both sustainable and equitable. It is time, Madam President, for Congress to wake up. I yield the floor.
President.
Senator from Ohio.
Madam President, I rise today to talk about the budget agreement that's before the United States Senate. We had a vote today on moving ahead to that legislation, and